All right, I'm going to now hand over to Sally Moxham from Global Covenant of Mayors to talk about the new report that was released, the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
My name's Sally Moxham. I'm the Manager for Strategy and Partnerships for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy program. I'm employed by ICLEI Oceania in Melbourne, and ICLEI is an international organisation for local governments working for sustainability. It's been around for decades, and Oceania comprises New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea and the South Pacific Island nation states. Just a bit about the Global Covenant of Mayors. It's a program that's focusing on getting local governments to measure community sector greenhouse gas emissions, develop a plan for those emissions to be reduced through a range of actions, and then report against that plan. So one of the things that GCoM, as we call it, program participants need to do is an emissions inventory and also set targets and regularly report against those. So it's been going for a number of years. You can see this picture here, the guidance document was put together by a number of organisations, and they're our partner organisations. You've got CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, which provides the internet portal for the reporting process. They're in Hong Kong. You've got C40 Cities, WWF, the World Resources Institute. So they're all partners, and they have a relationship to the UNFCCC. So ICLEI, for example, is one of the parties that is represented at the Conference of Parties in terms of providing a local government voice. And the document before you has come out of a funding submission to the Rockefeller Foundation, where they said, actually, there's all this discussion about targets. You know, we've gone from random targets with the zero on the end of them on this journey through to science-based targets. And let's get some funding to actually have a discussion about, you know, what methodologies are out there. So the document focuses on the IPCC goal of keeping climate change to below 1.5 degrees warming, and it focuses on methodologies that aim to look at net zero emissions roughly by 2050, but importantly setting an interim target by 2030, which is a requirement of the suggestion of the IPCC and of the Conference of Parties. So without going into a lot of detail, the document basically says there's three key principles in setting a science-derived target. One, that it's derived by science. Two, that it's equitable, i.e. that countries that pollute more need to take a greater share of the action in reducing those emissions. And thirdly, that emissions, it needs to be a complete portfolio. So you can't just focus on carbon dioxide emissions. You need to pick up your methane, nitrous oxide, and a range of other greenhouse gases. It has to be complete. So it briefly discusses three methodologies. Those methodologies are the Tyndall Centre approach, which is a UK climate think tank, which I won't go into today. It canvasses the two other methodologies. One of those is the One Planet City Challenge, and that methodology looks at all the countries in the world and applies what we call a Human Development Index. So that's an indicator that applies to countries to measure their development progress. And then that is applied in an algorithm to your greenhouse gas inventory, and it gives you a target for 2030. It doesn't give you a carbon budget, and it doesn't give you a trajectory. So it just gives you a percentage reduction target for 2030. So the other option there is looking at the C40 Deadline 2020 methodology. And that takes, again, you start off with your emissions inventory, and in working out your 2030 target, what it does, it has two inputs. It works out your city typology, and the two inputs for that are what is your greenhouse gas emissions per capita? And in Australia, that's going to be pretty high, particularly say in Victoria, where we've still got a lot of brown coal. It also then looks at your gross domestic product or your gross city product, so your indicator of economic wealth as a nation. And again, the typology for most Australian cities will be, in terms of GDP, quite high. So what we end up for a 2030 target is a percentage reduction factor of around 70 to 75% for cities, the more wealthy cities. And C40, as you might know, is really focused on the larger cities. The two C40 cities in Australia are Sydney and Melbourne, and Auckland in New Zealand. But you can look at the City of Melbourne's greenhouse mitigation plan, and it has a target within that range. So You can see hypertext links there that will take you to those documents in a lot of detail. Now, for GCoM councils, GCoM and ICLEI don't have a specific target, but point cities in the direction of achieving ambition, which I'll go on and talk about in the next slide. So here we come to the Race to Zero slide. So the Race to Zero is a campaign initiated by the United Nations in the lead up to COP26, which is in Glasgow in November next year. So it's really calling upon local governments. So this is GCoM, ICLEI, calling upon local governments to pledge to reach a net zero target by 2040 or sooner, to then develop an interim target for 2030 that reflects a fair share of the 50% of global reduction in carbon emissions equivalent by 2030, which has been identified in the IPCC report. Then develop a plan, report on that plan, and publish that plan. So for cities interested in being part of the Race to Zero campaign, you can contact ICLEI, contact me, and we'll provide you with more information, but you can hear more of that over the coming months. And this is the boring bit. I just thought I'd point out, here you've got your guide for cities, which came out in November this year, but there's a whole range of documents. Another couple of ones that are relevant would be the global standard for community scale greenhouse gas emission inventories. So what are the accounting protocols you need to know about in terms of setting up your inventory? And I just wanted to point out that if this is all too much, we have a help desk at ICLEI to help people with this process in terms of the GCoM program. And then the third document there is the mitigation standards. So that's for how you measure actions against your plan in terms of a gold standard. That's all from me. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sally. I'm now going to make David presenter and just smash through and do that right now while I give David, I think you can share your screen now, the most briefest of welcomes. So Sally and Imogen have been at these webinars before. If you don't know David, Research Director for Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, climate policy and science expert, and anyone who has been involved in working in climate, local government or anything for 20 years will have seen David and his colleagues, Phil Sutton, Ian Dunlop, through Green Leap, Climate Code Red, Renew Economy, wherever it might be. David, over to you.
Okay, is that working?
No, not yet. I don't think so anyway. Let's have.
Okay, look, I'll do it without. Look, thanks for the opportunity. In terms of science-derived targets, obviously the starting point is the IPCC report, particularly the 2018 report. So I just want to talk about the IPCC figures just briefly. The first point, we did a report 2 years ago called What Lies Beneath, on what might be called scientific reticence or conservatism, and it particularly focused on the IPCC. And in that report, we had a forward from Professor Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, who's the head of the Potsdam Institute, advisor to the Pope, advisor to the EU, advisor to Angela Merkel. And he said in our comments on IPCC conservatism that, and I quote, "When the issue is the survival of civilization, conventional means of scientific analysis may become useless." So that's just a warning to say that the IPCC reports are often conservative. For example, on sea level rise, they said about 0.5 metre to 2100. US government agencies use 2 to 2.5 meters as their worst case example. And why is that relevant? Well, if you look at something like councils in Victoria will be aware of the Fisherman's Bend project near the port in Melbourne, where an old industrial suburb is now being redeveloped to hold 80,000 people. And the US government sea level rise scenarios were not applied, because if you did, and the Victorian government did do not this, you would find that the whole of Fisherman's Bend is likely to be underwater by 2100. So just a warning that IPCC reports are conservative. But in terms of their figures, as Lexi has already indicated, the IPCC has a budget of around 1,170 tonnes of carbon dioxide for a 2/3 chance of 2 degrees, 2/3 chance. If you divide that by the global population, you find that equal per capita shares around the world leads you to 150 tonnes per person of CO2 for the carbon budget. In Australia, we produce more than 20 tonnes a year. Divide 20 into 150, and you find that the IPCC's carbon budget for Australia lasts 7.5 years, from 2018 when the report came out. That means that for Australia, for a 2/3 chance of not exceeding 2 degrees, the budget runs out in 2025. So that's a fairly staggering number for people to come to grips with. And of course, equal per capita emissions are not equitable because we have a large carbon footprint, and developing nations really have a much greater right to that remaining budget than we do. So what's the bottom line from this? The problem is that if you've got a 2/3 chance of not exceeding 2 degrees, you actually have a 10% chance of getting to 3 degrees. So this budget has a 10% chance of getting to 3 degrees, and we would not board a plane. We would not get on a plane if there was a 1 in 10 chance, a 10% chance of crashing, but that's a method of international climate policy making. So these carbon budgets are really very tricky and overestimate the budget that's available, even, as I said, with my figures of Australia's emissions running out in 2025. So what's the take home? Look, the science is really clear. We've just produced a report called Climate Reality Check that's available at climaterealitycheck.net. It's now well understood there is no carbon budget for 1.5. The latest climate models show that we will hit 1.5 in 6 to 8 years from now. 1.5 is really close. Between 2026 and 2028, we're going to hit 1.5. If you want a 10% chance of not exceeding 2 degrees, there's no carbon budget for 2 degrees either. That's what Mike Raupak from CSIRO showed back in 2014. So the question is how fast? I mean, people ask me this all the time. We want a number, and my answer is really simple. How fast should we get to zero? The answer was yesterday. I'm not joking. I mean, it's really serious. I mean, at 1.5 degrees, we'll be past tipping points. When we should have been at zero emissions? Yesterday. How fast? As fast as humanly possible. So, you know, set whatever target you want, but understand that we are shooting way past 1.5. In another decade of emissions, we will have more than 2 degrees locked in, and the system will then become chaotic. So choose whatever number you want. Make it under 2030s if you can, because that's closer to the science, but understand that the real target should have been yesterday. Thanks very much.
That's fantastic, David, and thank you for that. Really clear, and just so you know, I've put in the chat box, everyone can jump on to download the What Lies Beneath report, and also Climate Reality Check, and I would concur with what you've just said there. So I think it's interesting. We're coming potentially from different points of view, but yeah, well said.
We end up in the same place.
We do, yes,
which was yesterday.
Possible.
I'm sure Imogen will agree too.
Yep. And then I guess, and yeah, as you know, our work then is for the councils that have got different drivers, different ways, and different, you know, for those that look at targets and want to know how do we meet it. If it's yesterday, then you're in a bit of trouble. Look, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the questions while I come back and share my screen. One question is there a science-derived sector carbon budget for corporate local government? Again, if you are comfortable with the IPCC science, etc., then yes, there is. And this is actually the SBT, Science-Based Targets Initiative, essentially comes from corporate. And the only reason we're called what we call the science-derived targets is just to differentiate from that and talk about it from a local government point of view. I'm going to make myself presenter and jump in show my screen. Okay, I'm assuming people can see these. Interesting to note there's general consensus on the budget required to achieve community emissions reductions. I've heard 2 to 5% been mentioned, and there was a similar question that's come through in the GoToWebinar question box from Phil. Are all the targets assuming a linear decrease? No, I mean, I don't think you can. Again, if it's used, and I go back to David's point too, around the point of a target, if it has to be done, then make it as soon as possible. I'd suggest that you can use it if it's for, you know, getting to somewhere to make sure that you're factoring in things that are going to be impacting on your emissions profile anyway. So, for example, decarbonisation of the grid, EV take up, it's definitely not going to be linear. What are the presenters' thoughts on the, this is a hard one, so I'm going to go through this quickly, probably going to pass to you, Imogen or David. This is from Tim. What are your thoughts on the BOM 2020 climate report stating we've got 1.44 degrees warming, and how should we use the BOM data to drive action? David, do you want to give that a 30-second shot?
Look, that's warming over Australia, and warming is closer, is higher over land than it is globally. I mean, I think the really disturbing figures which came out today from the United States is that warming globally this year is running at almost 1.3 degrees, 1.29 for the first 11 months of this year. And there's now a 90% chance that that this year will be the highest year on record around the world, even though we're in a La Nina, which is normally cooler. So we are now very close to 1.5. So yes, the urgency is now extreme.
Derek has asked what percentage of Australian councils are members of GCoM. Sally, what are you up to?
I don't have a percentage, but we have about 26 councils that are members in Australia and about 38 councils across the South Pacific and Papua New Guinea. And we're in a recruiting phase at the moment. So if you're interested in GCoM, give me an email and I can send you a whole lot of background information. The International GCoM website has just been updated and it's got lots more information about the kind of pathways and journeys that you need to follow for the GCoM program.
A little bit of informal analysis earlier in the year showed that, I mean, nearly 80–90% of councils are either a part of GCoM, Cities Power Partnership, and or climate emergency, make climate emergency declarations. So most are covered one way or another, I guess, by some of those programs. Imogen, I think this is for you. Of the councils addressing community emissions, what percentage are also focusing on operations? Do you know off the top of your head? And Josh is asking because take the approach of practice what we preach, even if we're only 1% of emissions, it can be seen as enforcement as opposed to leadership.
So I don't have a number in front of me, but I think it was about 10% are doing both at the moment, and about 25% are just doing council only. So I think, yeah, we've still got a big step up to take to get this happening across the board. And yeah, I agree. I think probably the take-home message is spend as little time as possible on your target and as much time as possible on the actions that will actually reduce emissions. And yeah, getting your community involved is a key process to actually enabling this to happen, because council only has control over so much. And I think councils and communities collectively advocating for better solutions at state and federal government level is a key outcome for this to work and for us to achieve it.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to ask others for a quick 30-second take-home too, if that's okay. Sally, what's your closing take-home comments? We're going to go a minute over time. I hope that's okay.
I totally agree with Imogen. It's about getting action and it's about getting councillors excited. So, I mean, one of the things that ICLEI does quite well and GCoM does quite well is give councillors a platform to be active in that kind of international advocacy space. But at the end of the day, it's about your community and getting them motivated. Thanks.
David? I'm a councillor. I come to you and I say, David, I want to set a target. Give us advice. What's your take-home message?
Go and talk to the community, involve them. This is about everybody. This is about a council. This is a whole of society, whole of community, whole of council problem. So everybody pitch in. I keep on saying all hands on deck.
Great. I concur. We can, you can set the target, and if it's going to work for you, great. And if undertaking the analysis helps show that it's going to show people that are making the decisions the scale of the problem and the urgency, great. But if not, you just need to move. And I think that's why, yeah, post this, if you're after, and Imogen, we've had many discussions over the year or so about trying to incorporate targets within Snapshot, just really so we can just tick it off and you can move on to the more important stuff, which is action and planning. Same, I guess, to have Snapshot in the first place is to make sure that we can move on from developing profiles to understand where the emissions are from and actually jump onto where the scale of requirements, urgency, I'd say if it is something that you need to do for a program, then make sure it works for you. Otherwise, totally concur with the others. Thank you so much, Imogen, David and Sally, for coming along. In the chat function there, I've got the feedback form. Please give us feedback. We spend a bit of time going through these things, and I hope people realise too at the start when we talk about who you are and the questions that we do try and get to them. So the feedback is much appreciated. Jump on there, and what's more, as soon as you do send that feedback, we will send the information on how you get this document that basically talks a little bit about what we've said today and the various drivers and the various reasons to have targets or otherwise. And I think and I hope that if my colleagues here on the line today were to have a look through that when we talk about the recommendations, we are aligned there. We are absolutely not saying do this and have a target that says 16.3 years. It's about making sure it works for you for action. There it is. It's down the bottom there. I'm going to type that in 1 or 2 more times and say thank you very much and farewell for the year. Bring on 2021. We will catch you in the new year. Thanks, everyone.